He was the most powerful alpha in North America, yet he sat freezing in the gutters of his own territory, bleeding and begging for scraps. He wanted to see who was truly loyal. What he found was ultimate betrayal and an outcast Omega who would change the werewolf world forever. Caspian Sterling was not a man who trusted blindly. As the alpha of the Blood Moon Syndicate, a massive, sprawling pack territory encompassing the darkest, most rugged mountains of the Pacific Northwest, he had built an empire on strength, strategy, and absolute law. But lately, whispers of corruption had reached his ears, accounts of the lower-ranking pack members starving, while the elite gorged themselves on imported luxuries. Reports of rogue attacks on the borders where his enforcers were supposed to be standing guard. Caspian suspected the rot started from the top. Specifically, he suspected his beta, Gideon Hayes. To uncover the truth, Caspian knew he couldn't simply launch an investigation. Gideon was too smart, too thoroughly entrenched in pack politics to leave a paper trail. Caspian needed to see the reality of his pack with his own eyes, stripped of his title, his wealth, and his intimidating aura. On a freezing Tuesday in late November, Caspian staged a hunting accident near the treacherous cliffs of the northern border. He left his torn, bloodied jacket at the edge of a ravine. Then he did the unthinkable for an alpha. He suppressed his wolf, using a dangerous, toxic paste made of crushed wolfsbane and dead nettle. He rubbed the mixture into his skin. The agonizing burn masked his overpowering alpha pheromones, replacing his signature scent of pine and lightning with the sickly, sour smell of a dying, broken rogue. He donned filthy, threadbare clothes he'd stolen from a human dumpster in Seattle, rubbing soot and freezing mud into his face and hair. He inflicted superficial but bloody slashes across his ribs and arms. By the time he limped back into the heart of his own capital, Blackwood Pines, he was unrecognizable. He wasn't Caspian Sterling, the billionaire Alpha King. He was a piece of trash, dragging himself through the snow. It was the night of the Winter Solstice Gala. The town square was a dazzling display of wealth. Fairy lights dripped from the ancient pines, and the scent of roasted venison, expensive champagne, and rich perfumes filled the crisp night air. The elite of the pack, wrapped in designer furs and tailored suits, laughed and danced around a massive bonfire. Caspian collapsed near the entrance of the grand pavilion, the freezing slush seeping through his ripped jeans. He reached out a trembling, mud-caked hand. "Please," Caspian rasped, his voice intentionally weak and gravelly. "A scrap of meat. A blanket. I haven't eaten in days." A pair of stiletto heels stopped inches from his face. Caspian looked up to see Sylvia Croft, the daughter of his lead financial advisor. Sylvia was notorious for her vanity, but to Caspian's face, she had always played the sweet, devoted pack member. Now her face contorted in absolute disgust. "You! Get away from me, you filthy stray!" she sneered, deliberately kicking a spray of icy slush directly into Caspian's face. "Guards! Why is there a rogue in the VIP section? It smells like rotting garbage." Caspian bit his tongue, filing her name away. Moments later, the heavy boots of enforcers approached, parting the crowd. And there he was, Gideon Hayes. The beta stepped forward, looking resplendent in a charcoal suit, a silver lapel pin gleaming in the firelight. As the interim leader in Caspian's absence, Gideon was soaking up the power. "What is the meaning of this?" Gideon demanded, his voice devoid of the warm, brotherly tone he always used with Caspian. "Beta Hayes," Caspian begged, forcing himself to cough violently. "I am a wolf of no pack. I was attacked by mountain lions. I beg for sanctuary under the laws of the moon goddess. Just a place by the fire." Gideon looked down at him, his eyes cold and calculating. There was no pity, only a cruel, twisted amusement. "The moon goddess helps those who are strong enough to help themselves," Gideon sneered, his voice loud enough for the elite crowd to hear and murmur in agreement. "My alpha, may he rest in peace, would never allow weak, pathetic leeches to drain our resources. We are a pack of apex predators, not a charity ward. Caspian's heart turned to ice. My Alpha would never allow this. Gideon was using Caspian's name to justify his own cruelty. Throw this piece of filth into the lower wastes, Gideon ordered the enforcers, waving his hand dismissively. Let the cold take him. If he survives the night, run him off the territory. Two massive enforcers grabbed Caspian by his injured arms. The pain from his self-inflicted wounds flared, but the betrayal in his chest hurt far worse as they dragged him away from the warmth of the fire, away from the music and the laughter. Caspian looked back. He saw Gideon laughing with Sylvia, clinking champagne glasses. His inner wolf, suppressed and poisoned by the wolfsbane, snarled in the dark. They will all pay. The enforcers didn't just escort Caspian to the lower wastes. They beat him first. They threw him into the back of a rusted pickup truck, drove him to the absolute edge of the territory where the poorest members of the pack lived, and kicked him out into a snowdrift. Don't let us catch you crawling back up the hill, stray, one of them spat, before the truck peeled away into the night. Caspian lay in the snow, gasping for air. The temperature was dropping fast, well below zero. The wolfsbane paste was working too well. It was actively poisoning his system, preventing his rapid alpha healing from kicking in. His limbs were going numb. The edges of his vision blurred with dark spots. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King was genuinely afraid he might freeze to death in his own lands. He dragged himself through the dark, treacherous alleys of the wastes. The smell here was entirely different from the town square. It smelled of desperation, burning garbage, and damp, rotting wood. The shacks were made of corrugated metal and discarded plywood. He collapsed against the wooden steps of a particularly dilapidated cabin at the very end of a dead-end dirt road. He couldn't go any further. The darkness was pulling him under. Just as his eyes fluttered shut, the creak of a flimsy wooden door echoed above him. Warm amber light spilled out onto the snow. "Oh, goddess!" a soft, panicked voice gasped. Small, freezing hands grabbed his shoulders. Caspian groaned, too weak to fight back as the figure struggled to pull him out of the snowbank. It was a monumental effort. Caspian weighed over 220 pounds of pure muscle, and the person dragging him was shockingly frail. "Come on, you have to help me," the voice pleaded, straining with exertion. "You can't stay out here. You'll die." With the last ounce of his strength, Caspian pushed with his legs, helping her drag him over the threshold. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the howling wind. Caspian blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of a single kerosene lamp. He was lying on a floor made of splintered wood. Sitting beside him, chest heaving from the effort, was a girl. She looked to be in her early 20s. She wore a threadbare, oversized grey sweater full of holes, and her hands were raw and red from the cold. But what struck Caspian the most were her eyes. Wide, startlingly clear pools of hazel, filled with an empathy he hadn't seen in years. This was Lyra Abbott. Caspian knew of the Abbotts. They were an Omega family. Years ago, Lyra's parents had been killed during a border skirmish because Gideon had deemed the area strategically unimportant and denied them backup. Caspian had signed off on the compensation paperwork, blindly trusting Gideon's report that the family was well cared for. Looking at the freezing, half-starved girl in front of him, Caspian realized the horrifying extent of his beta's lies. "You're bleeding," Lyra whispered, rushing to a small wood stove in the corner. It barely gave off any heat. She grabbed a ragged towel, soaked it in a tin pot of warm water sitting on the stove, and hurried back to his side. Gently, with a reverence he had never experienced, she began to clean the dirt and blood from his face. "Why?" Caspian managed to croak, maintaining his gravelly disguise. "Why are you helping me? I'm a rogue." Lyra offered a sad, tired smile. "Pain doesn't care about pack status. You were freezing." She stood up and walked over to a small, rickety cupboard. Caspian watched her intently. The shack was entirely bare. There was a thin mattress on the floor in the corner, a single chair, and the stove. That was it. Lyra opened the cupboard. Inside sat a single small heel of sourdough bread. It was rock-hard and completely stale. It was undeniably her only food. Without a second thought, Lyra pulled it out. She brought it to the stove, poured a small amount of hot water into a chipped ceramic bowl, and broke the hard bread into the water to soften it. She brought the bowl over to Caspian, kneeling beside him. She scooped up a soggy piece of the bread with a wooden spoon and held it to his lips. "Eat," she coaxed softly. "It's not much. It's just bread and a little chicken bouillon I saved, but it will warm your stomach." Caspian's throat tightened. He was a man who dined on Wagyu beef and imported truffles. He had a cellar of wine worth more than this entire side of the mountain. Yet, as he ate the watery, stale bread from the hands of this starving Omega, it was the best meal he had ever tasted, because it was seasoned with absolute, unselfish sacrifice. "You should eat," Caspian whispered, pushing the spoon back toward her. "You're starving." "I ate earlier," Lyra lied, her stomach letting out a quiet, traitorous rumble. She flushed red, looking down. "I'm used to it. My wolf is small. She doesn't need much. Besides, you need the strength to heal." Suddenly, through the haze of the toxic wolfsbane masking his senses, Caspian's inner wolf slammed against the cages of his ribs. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was a desperate, primal whine of recognition. Mate. The scent was incredibly faint beneath the smell of damp wood and cheap kerosene. But it was there. Wild flowers and fresh rain. Lyra, the broken, bullied Omega, was his fated mate. The moon goddess had an incredible sense of irony. Caspian reached up, his large, mud-stained hand gently wrapping around her small, freezing wrist. He felt the spark, the undeniable electric jolt of the mate bond. Lyra gasped, her hazel eyes flying up to meet his, clearly feeling the shock wave too. Before either of them could speak, before Caspian could figure out how to reveal his true identity, a terrifying sound shattered the quiet intimacy of the cabin. Crack! The flimsy wooden door splintered inward, kicked off its hinges by a massive steel-toed boot. Snow and freezing wind blasted into the room, blowing out the kerosene lamp. Silhouetted in the doorway stood Wyatt, the ruthless captain of the enforcers, flanked by 3 massive wolves. They were holding heavy wooden batons. "Well, well, well," Wyatt sneered, stepping into the shack, his boots crunching on the splintered door. "Beta Gideon gave the order to sweep the wastes tonight. We're clearing out the trash before Alpha Silas from the Red Moon Pack arrives tomorrow. Looks like we caught ourselves an Omega, harboring an illegal rogue." Lyra scrambled backward, terrified, throwing her frail body directly in front of Caspian to shield him. "He's hurt!" Lyra cried out, her voice trembling but defiant. "He's not hurting anyone. Please, Wyatt, just leave him be." Wyatt laughed, a cruel, guttural sound. He raised his baton, aiming it squarely at Lyra's head. "Harboring a rogue is an exile offense, Abbott. Looks like we're dragging 2 bodies out into the snow tonight." As Wyatt swung the baton downward, Caspian's eyes flashed a brilliant, lethal gold in the darkness. Wyatt's wooden baton descended in a deadly arc. It never reached Lyra. A sound like a thunderclap echoed in the tiny, freezing cabin. Caspian's hand, previously trembling and weak, shot upward with terrifying speed. His massive fingers clamped around the thick oak of the baton, stopping it dead in the air. The sheer force of the impact sent a shock wave through Wyatt's arm, snapping his wrist with a sickening crack. Wyatt screamed, dropping to his knees. The toxic wolfsbane paste on Caspian's skin was still burning, but the lethal threat to his mate triggered a primal, biological override. The suppression shattered. The cramped, dilapidated shack was instantly suffocated by an oppressive, terrifying pressure. It was the pure, unfiltered aura of an Alpha King. The air grew impossibly heavy, smelling of ozone, cracking thunder, and ancient pine. The 3 enforcers behind Wyatt choked, their hands flying to their throats as they were forced to their knees by the sheer, crushing weight of Caspian's dominance. "You dare!" Caspian's voice was no longer the gravelly rasp of a beggar. It was a dark, vibrating rumble that shook the wooden floorboards. His eyes blazed like twin suns in the darkness, cutting through the shadows. He rose slowly, his towering frame dwarfing the room. The illusion of the broken rogue vanished, replaced by a predator of unparalleled lethality. He reached out, grabbing Wyatt by the throat, effortlessly lifting the heavy enforcer off the ground with a single hand. "Who gave the order to execute innocent pack members?" Caspian demanded softly, though the quietness of his tone was more terrifying than a roar. Wyatt gasped, his legs kicking frantically, his eyes bulging in sudden, horrifying recognition. Alpha Caspian. We thought you were dead." "You hoped I was dead," Caspian corrected, his grip tightening just enough to cut off Wyatt's air. "Because dead men cannot witness treason. Beta Gideon ordered this?" Wyatt nodded frantically, a pathetic whimper escaping his lips. Caspian tossed the captain aside like a discarded toy. Wyatt crashed through the splintered doorway, landing in a heap in the snow outside, instantly unconscious. The other 3 enforcers remained pinned to the floor by Caspian's aura, sobbing in absolute terror. "Return to the barracks," Caspian commanded, his voice echoing with absolute alpha compulsion. "You will lock yourselves in the holding cells. If a single one of you speaks a word of my survival to Gideon, I will personally tear your wolves from your chests. Go." They scrambled up, tripping over themselves as they fled into the blizzard, leaving behind the shattered door. Silence descended on the cabin, save for the howling wind. Caspian turned slowly, his glowing eyes dimming back to their natural, piercing blue as he looked down at Lyra. She was pressed against the far wall, trembling violently, her hazel eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. She had just shared her only meal with the most feared man in North America. "You," she breathed, her voice shaking. "You're the Alpha." Caspian took a step forward, his expression softening entirely. The brutal warlord vanished, leaving behind a man who had just found his missing half. He sank to his knees in front of her, ignoring the freezing wind blowing through the broken door. "I am," he said gently, reaching out to cup her cold cheek. The mate bond sparked again, sending a wave of warmth through both of them that chased away the winter chill. "And you, Lyra Abbott, have more honor and courage in your little finger than my entire Beta bloodline." Lyra swallowed hard, leaning instinctively into his touch. "They're going to kill you. Gideon told everyone you fell into the Shadow Ravine. He's taking the Alpha Oath tomorrow at noon when the Red Moon pack arrives." Caspian's jaw clenched, a dangerous, calculating smile touching his lips. "Let him try. Tomorrow, the pack will see exactly what kind of monster they've been worshipping. But tonight, I need your help, little wolf." Lyra looked at the bare walls of her freezing shack, then back at the billionaire Alpha. "My help? I need to wash this poison off my skin," Caspian said, looking down at his blistering arms. "And I need you to tell me everything Gideon has done to the lower wastes." For the rest of the night, they barricaded the broken door with the heavy wood stove. Lyra used the last of her clean water to carefully wash the toxic wolfsbane from Caspian's skin. As the poison washed away, his supernatural healing finally kicked in, closing the self-inflicted wounds and knitting his bruised flesh back together. In return, she told him the truth. She told him about the embezzled pack funds, the staged rogue attacks that Gideon used to justify raising taxes on the poorest members, and how Sylvia's father had manipulated the pack's stock portfolio to bankrupt the lower class while enriching the elite. Caspian listened, his fury turning into a cold, unbreakable diamond. His pack was rotting, and tomorrow he would surgically remove the infection. The next day brought a pale, biting sun over Blackwood Pines. The central plaza, usually a place of community, was transformed into an arena of oppressive power. Banners bearing Gideon's family crest were already replacing Caspian's across the town hall. A massive stage had been erected. Gideon stood at the center, draped in a luxurious black fur cloak, looking every bit the grieving, reluctant leader. Beside him stood Sylvia, wearing a designer mourning dress that looked more suited for a red carpet gala, wiping away fake tears for the cameras. Seated in the front row was Alpha Silas of the Red Moon Pack, a notoriously harsh leader who respected only strength and wealth. He watched the proceedings with a critical, unreadable eye, accompanied by his elite guard. "My brothers and sisters," Gideon's voice boomed over the speakers, thick with feigned sorrow. "The loss of Alpha Caspian is a tragedy that cuts to the bone. But the Blood Moon Syndicate cannot show weakness. We must remain apex predators." Gideon paced the stage, his gaze sweeping over the thousands of pack members gathered in the cold. The wealthy elites cheered near the front, while the impoverished members from the wastes huddled in the back, silent and fearful. "To prove our strength to our honored guest, Alpha Silas, we must cleanse our territory of the weak and the treacherous," Gideon declared. He gestured to the side of the stage. "Bring out the traitor!" Two enforcers dragged a struggling figure onto the platform. It was Lyra. Her hands were bound with heavy silver chains that burned her wrists, but she held her head high, her hazel eyes completely devoid of fear. "This Omega," Gideon snarled, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at her, "was caught last night harboring a rogue in the lower wastes, a direct violation of pack law. She represents the rot at the bottom of our society, a drain on our resources. Today her exile will serve as the first act of my new reign." "Asa." The elite crowd jeered. Sylvia leaned forward, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Throw the trash out, Gideon," she called out musically. Alpha Silas narrowed his eyes, clearly unimpressed by the theatrical display of bullying an Omega. Gideon raised his hand to signal the enforcers to drag her away. "If you lay another hand on my Luna, Gideon, I will ensure there is nothing left of you to bury." The voice didn't come from the speakers. It came from the back of the plaza, but it carried with such devastating acoustic power that the ground physically trembled beneath their feet. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Striding through the center of the terrified pack was Caspian. He was no longer the muddy, bleeding beggar. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit, his shoulders broad, his posture radiating absolute, lethal authority. His eyes were glowing a brilliant, terrifying gold. He didn't just walk, he stalked towards the stage, the air warping around him with the heat of his unchecked alpha aura. Gasps of shock and screams of terror ripped through the crowd. Sylvia shrieked, dropping her champagne glass. It shattered loudly against the cobblestones. Gideon's face drained of all color. He stumbled backward, his confident facade instantly crumbling into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "Caspian! No, it's a trick. He's dead. The ravines are not nearly deep enough to hide your treason, Beta," Caspian roared, leaping onto the 10-foot-high stage in a single, gravity-defying bound. The enforcers holding Lyra immediately dropped to their knees, submitting their necks to their true king. Caspian didn't even look at them. He walked straight to Lyra, his glowing eyes softening as he reached out, effortlessly snapping the heavy silver chains as if they were made of cheap plastic. He pulled her against his side, tucking her under his arm in a universal, undisputed claim. "Mine," Caspian growled, the word echoing across the silent, stunned plaza. He then turned his predatory gaze back to Gideon. "I walked among you as a beggar. I was beaten. I was starved. I was thrown to the cold by the very men sworn to protect this pack. And the only soul who offered me sanctuary, who offered me her last piece of bread when she was starving herself, was this Omega." Caspian pointed at Gideon, his voice dripping with lethal promise. "I have seen the ledgers, Gideon. I know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans, the staged rogue attacks. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our people to line your own pockets." Alpha Silas stood up from his VIP seat, a slow, grim smile spreading across his scarred face. "Well, this is certainly more entertaining than an oath ceremony. It seems you have a pest problem, Alpha Caspian." "Not for long," Caspian replied smoothly. Gideon panicked. He shifted mid-stride, bursting out of his clothes as a massive, dark brown wolf, lunging straight for Caspian's throat in a desperate, suicidal bid for power. Caspian didn't even bother fully shifting. He caught the massive wolf mid-air by the throat with one hand, his arm muscles bulging against his suit jacket. With a brutal, fluid motion, Caspian slammed Gideon onto the wooden stage so hard the thick planks splintered and caved in. Caspian placed his boot on Gideon's chest, pinning the whimpering wolf down. "Gideon Hayes, you are stripped of your title, your wealth, and your pack," Caspian announced, his voice booming with absolute finality. "You and your co-conspirators, including the Croft family, will be escorted to the borders immediately. You are rogues now. May the moon goddess show you the same mercy you showed the beggars at your gates." The crowd erupted, not in cheers for the elite, but in a deafening roar of approval from the lower wastes. The oppressed were finally being heard. Caspian turned to Lyra, the terrifying Alpha King, melting away as he looked at the woman who had saved his life and his pack. He dropped to one knee, right there on the shattered stage, in front of the entire pack and the visiting Alpha. "You gave me your only bread when you thought I was nothing," Caspian said softly, taking her small, rough hands in his. "Now, I offer you my throne, my pack, and my heart. Will you be my Luna, Lyra?" Tears streamed down Lyra's face, washing away years of hardship and loneliness. She didn't have to speak. Her soul sang the answer. She threw her arms around his neck, and as the Alpha King stood, lifting his new Luna into the air, the true era of the Blood Moon Syndicate began. An era built not on greed, but on the unwavering strength of a stale piece of bread and a heart of pure gold. Did Caspian's revenge satisfy your craving for justice? If you loved this story of a hidden king and his brave Omega, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment about your favorite twist, and subscribe to the channel for more epic werewolf dramas. Share this with your friends who love a good underdog story, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.